the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, a new organization in Chicago that is dedicated to the proposition of the Chicagoland people getting their information on critical issues in science and technology from people who know something about the subject. My name is Alan Schriesheim. I am the president of the Chicago Council on Science and Technology and the director emeritus of Argonne National Laboratory. It is fitting, I believe, more than fitting, that the topic of today, essentially how to produce energy in an environmentally benign fashion, is a topic that is certainly high on the list of the incoming administration. And we're particularly fortunate to have the Chief Executive Officer of Exelon, John Rowe, as our speaker to discuss this topic. I can't resist saying that I'm delighted that we have so many students and teachers in the audience. We have a goodly number, almost 50, and you are the folks that eventually, well, you probably vote now, actually, but have to vote on these important topics. And as I say, getting your information from people who know something about the topic is really critical. Well, John Rowe is the chairman, as I mentioned, and chief executive officer of Exelon Corporation. It is a utility holding company, of course, headquartered here in Chicago. It has the largest market cap in the electric utility industry. It also is the operator of the largest fleet of nuclear power plants in the nation. John is considered to be, and indeed is, a leader in the industry. I am not going to read through a number of these, but John is committed to as a strong civic and charitable commitment, and Exelon is one of the sponsors of the Chicago Council on Science and Technology. John is chairman of the Commercial Club, where I see him quite often, the Illinois Institute of Technology, Chicago History Museum, the boards of the Field Museum, Civil War Museum of Philadelphia, Wisconsin Alumni Foundation, so forth. Impressively, the Rowe and the Rowe Family Trust have founded the Rowe Professorship of Architecture, the Rowe Family Endowed Chair in Sustainable Energy at IIT, the Rowe Professor of Byzantine History. Those of you, some of us collect, so that's impressive. And the Rowe Family Professorship in Greek History at the University of Wisconsin, so forth. Also, the trust has co-founded the Rowe Clark Math and Science Academy in Chicago. So John is a contributor, a mover and a shaker in the community and civic leadership. John and his wife reside in Chicago. They have one son. And I'm looking forward, as you are, to hearing John. So without further discussion on my part, John.
Thank you, Alan. I do appreciate the kind introduction. We utility executives take good words wherever we can get them. I particularly appreciate what Alan and this group are trying to do with the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, because in innumerable areas, I believe weakness in understanding of science is haunting our society, and it takes a group like this to fix it. I also think it's particularly important that we do so in the Midwest because New England and California keep beating us in the public and economic eye. And I'm quite certain we can do and do as much good science here as they do in those places, but we have not congealed the same level of support for science and scientific institutions here. That affects places like Argonne that Alan used to head and Fermi. We just don't have the political coalition behind them that they would have if they were in California. And that's something I think we need to work on. Most of my remarks tonight will deal with the climate issue, something I've been working on for about a decade. But I want to start with some more general observations on science and scientific conflicts. The one that concerns me most professionally is the disdain that much of the left in our polity has for the things that keep these lights on, which are called nuclear plants. And while there are many intellectual reasons for those questions, I think and I submit that it takes an understanding of both science and economics to think about why those nuclear plants are so important. Now, people say he runs 17 of them. Of course, he would say that. But think for a minute about the politics of building a new nuclear plant. Remember just one asymmetry in risk. If I build one and it works, it's named after my successor. And if I build one and it costs too much, it's named after me. So in some peculiar way, I think I'm as free from bias on the subject as anything else. We simply need better science and better understanding of science in utility matters. President Obama today in his inaugural address talked about wind and solar. I will talk about those two a little later. Yes, they work, and yes, they will help us deal with climate. They're also very expensive. Now, I try not to confine my interest in good science to utility matters, although they are very near and dear to my heart and near and dear to my wallet. As Alan mentioned, I do chair IIT, and some of you are here from there. I work very hard at the field, or at least try to. And I am the next president of the University of Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, which holds the basic patents on stem cell research. So if I am concerned about the left's attitude toward nuclear plants, I can assure you that I am equally concerned about the right's attitude toward stem cell research. Indeed, during the years when Dennis Hastert was Speaker, the only thing I ever wrote him about, other than energy, was to ask him to try to keep the Republican Party from crucifying itself on its opposition to stem cell research. I don't know that I did any good, but I tried. And also, the Rowe Family Trust, beholden to Lance Grande, who's here, is beginning to fund a curator in evolutionary biology at the field, because we simply can't quite figure out why the right has so much trouble with that either. The point I'm trying to make, is that pick your poison, and one end or the other of the political spectrum has a view on it that is not very scientific. The right professes great fear of genetic engineering in people. The left professes great fear of genetic engineering in foods. To me, the fear is as unfact-based in one case as the other. The point I'm trying to get at is we need the science in all these areas, but we need people who do science to reach out more diligently to communicate with the communities that are skeptical of their work. That is certainly true of folks like me with our nuclear power plants. You have to try to understand why people don't like you if you want to have any hope of convincing them otherwise. It is equally true of my friends at UW or Northwestern or Chicago and IIT on stem cell research. You have to figure out why it is that people resent what you're doing or fear what you're doing or are suspicious of what you're doing, and try to reach them on their own grounds instead of assuming they're fools. With that, I'll go back to something I know something about, which is climate and carbon. This is an area where the great Pogo cartoon, "We have met the enemy and he is us," is singularly apt. We are all dependent on carbon in an infinite number of ways, and before anyone picks his or her favorite polluter, they ought to remember what it is they're exhaling when they breathe. There is a wonderful old Star Trek movie where a rogue satellite, once Voyager but damaged into V'ger, roams the universe, rooting out those impure carbon-based organisms. Not a very happy prospect, but it will be equally hard to root carbon out of our energy base. We are, as a world, a carbon-based economy. And changing that is a challenge of enormous proportions. And yet at the same time, and I'll not rehash the science because most of you know that part better than I, the science is, in my judgment, overwhelming that global temperatures are rising, that rise has dangerous consequences, and that human carbon dioxide emissions are substantially contributing to it. We simply can't ignore all that science. And President Obama won't, and the new Congress won't. We must do something about it. Now, some say it's easy for Exelon to take the positions we have on climate. I mean, I have advocated climate legislation for nearly a decade, actually for more than a decade. And we at Exelon have tried to base our policies on the assumption that carbon would be limited for most of the decade. And for at least the last 5 years, we have been an active advocate of carbon legislation. Some, including a former chairman of the Interior Committee, said that that's hypocritical because our nuclear plants will be worth more with carbon legislation. They may be worth more, but it wasn't just accidental how we got them. I remember talking to Tom Ayers, whom some of you may know was president of ComEd back in the 70s one day. He's passed now. But he was a very sweet, gentle old man at the time I had this lunch. And he looked at me with genuine anguish in his face, and he said, "I don't know why we could never convince the environmentalists that we built these plants for environmental reasons." And I do know there are other sides to that argument. I also know he was utterly sincere in the making of it. Right now in this nation, as opposed to Illinois, about 50% of our energy comes from coal, which is the highest source of carbon dioxide emissions you can use. There's a wonderful joke, which I think is more than a little true, that either God or geology invented the perfect way to sequestrate carbon dioxide. It's called coal. And one can argue that leaving more of it in the ground is one of the best ways to deal with this. Coal produces over 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the electric sector. But the fuel that offers the cheapest and fastest way to reduce those emissions is natural gas. And it too is a carbon-based fuel, just one that you can use faster and burn more efficiently. As a general rule, the carbon dioxide contribution of using gas to make electricity is on the order of 50 to 60% that of coal. So you can make a pretty large difference there. Now, the new administration is, as I said, committing to deal with this. Parts of the stimulus package are addressed to low carbon forms of energy. That's a good thing. The new administration is backing a renewable portfolio standard. We'll talk more about that. And I believe the new administration and the congressional leadership are committed to more general carbon legislation. But as we think about this and what we do, we have to remember that we first need to start soon. It's almost too late. And second, we can't fix a problem we made over 200 years in 10 or 20. It's going to take a very long time. There's a wonderful Mark Twain line on nearly everything. The one that relates to this is, he wrote, "In the space of 176 years, the lower Mississippi has shortened itself by 242 miles. Thus, any idiot can see that 1,000,000 years ago it was 1,300,000 miles long. And in only 742 years, it will be down to less than 2 miles. Predicting these sorts of things is a very imprecise exercise, but we must act on what we know, and that involves the two disciplines practiced by most of the people in this room, which are some variation on science and some variation on economics. And surely we can do that in the city where Enrico Fermi built the first nuclear chain reaction pile. Right now, the U.S. gets about 20% of its electricity, far the largest low-carbon contribution, from nuclear plants, and Illinois has 11 of those that are working as we speak. Responses to the climate problem must lie in science and technology. The issue is, how do we bet on what technologies? And how do we get the markets to deliver new technologies that deal with this problem at the least possible cost? I had the chance about a couple of months ago to talk with the deputy head of the California Air Resources Board. And this is a fellow of good mind and extraordinary candor. He was addressing the board of an oil company, and he described his views of the climate problem in the most compelling terms. And then he described the California approach to dealing with climate as consisting of 3 prongs: a fuels policy for automobiles that I don't know enough about to talk about tonight, a renewable portfolio standard of 33% for electricity, and a cap and trade system for everything else. So I asked him how much the price per ton of carbon would be for the cap and trade system. And he said, oh, we think it will be as low as $10. McKinsey says it takes 50 on a national basis. But he said, and this is where the candor came in, that's because the fuel standard and the renewable portfolio standard will do all the work. So I said, what do you think the cost per ton of carbon will be under the RPS? He said, oh, we think that's $150 a ton. 15 times as much in the electricity business as elsewhere. Now, if you wonder what that does to an electric bill, it looks roughly like this. Average rates in California as we speak are around 18 cents a kilowatt hour. If you replace all the energy pursuant to that RPS, you add 15 cents to that just for this one thing. 15 cents just to go to a 33% renewable standard. In other words, you double the price of electricity, and there are a lot of other things driving it up too. Point is, you have to think about the science, and you have to think about the economics. Teddy Roosevelt once said, when you have a problem, you must do what you can where you are with what you got. I'm not a huge Teddy Roosevelt fan, but that's a very good line. Because in utility generation, we've seen some things work, like higher efficiency gasoline, natural gas, excuse me, and other things like fuel cells be promising forever and still not very powerful economically. You have to bet some on what you can. Now at Exelon, we wanted to make the point that we weren't just going to sit there. And we put out a document called Exelon 2020, which you can find on our website, which is a plan to neutralize or offset our entire carbon footprint by 2020. Now, it's sneaky in one sense. We're the only utility who can do it because of all of our nuclear plants. But it's profound in another sense. And that is that it's the only plan that's really out there to do it. And at its heart, it's not based on new nuclear plants, although it gets a lot easier if you have them. It's based on energy efficiency programs run by our utilities. It's based on burning more natural gas to displace coal. It's based on cleaning up our own energy consumption. We are very, very proud of our home office, which is a block and a half from here in the Chase building. 2 years ago, we redid 10 floors in that building. It's a 1969 or 70 building. We did them to LEED Platinum standards. At the time, and I think still, it was the largest LEED Platinum reconstruction job in the world. We cut our energy consumption in that building by 50%, and we did it economically. Now, we had the ability to free ride on some stuff the building was doing, but we're very proud of what we did there. Now, on the other hand, can we do it everywhere else on our system? Best we can do economically is around 25%, so we're setting off to do that. Exelon 2020 involves things like the use of offsets internationally, particularly in rainforest and tropical habitats, things Lance Grandy and Debbie Moskovitz work on, because you can offset carbon more cheaply there, and oh, by the way, you preserve both biodiversity and natural lifestyles. Exelon 2020 rests on getting more capacity out of those existing 11 nuclear plants in Illinois. Between the 11 we have here and the 7 we have in the 6 we have in the east, we've added over 1,000 megawatts to those nuclear plants. It's a huge amount of low carbon electricity. So that's what we're doing. But now as to public policy. There are 5 things you have to deal with the climate issue and to do it with any hope of either an effective end result or efficiency. The first is you have to have economy-wide carbon legislation, either a cap-and-trade system or a carbon tax. You can't deal with this problem economically without getting the market to provide incentives for lower carbon energy and penalties for higher carbon energy. And I was talking with one of the president's new people the other day, and he said, John, we're going to do energy efficiency, we're going to do renewables, but climate's going to be really, really hard. And I said, but it won't work unless you do the whole climate thing. And you surely will not get the cheap solutions if you do it. So that's the first answer. Second answer is a nationwide commitment to energy efficiency, and the president is leading that effort. Federal buildings have been a scandal for energy efficiency, and I'm quite certain that part of the stimulus package will end up being fixing that. Buildings that you all have somewhere have huge opportunities for greater efficiency. Many that are economic by today's standards, many that will not be economic until carbon is priced in the market. But they are important. We cannot do a good supply curve for energy efficiency. We simply don't know how much there is at what price. The Electric Power Research Institute, which is the best source of information I have, and the Energy Information Administration and DOE, both guess that you can cut the growth in energy consumption by something like a third, somewhere between a quarter and a half, depending on how hard you work at it. But that's only cutting the growth in energy use. It's not cutting today's energy use at all. My wife and I subsidize a high school in one of Chicago's most difficult neighborhoods. I was out there one day speaking to the kids, all of whom want to see climate dealt with. I asked these kids who do not have the kind of income that folks in this room do, how many of them had plasma televisions? 10%. Plasma televisions use 4 times as much energy as the old-fashioned kind. Every one of those kids has a cell phone. It's my understanding that babies are born with them now. Evolution is a marvelous thing, lads. So one of the things you have is that the more you do, the more people find new ways to use this wonderful stuff we call energy. And they particularly like to use electricity because it's the most convenient form of energy. The third thing we need to do is to deal with renewables. I certainly applaud the president's effort to jumpstart that in the stimulus package. Exelon will support a renewable portfolio standard on a national basis. But we will ask very carefully that the numbers in it not go as high as California's 33%, because it's an expensive way to solve the problem. We need to use renewable portfolio standards to drive the technology. But simply put, today's technology is not economic in most renewables. And while we hope tomorrow's technology will bring us new things, we will make as many mistakes as we will have successes. The fourth thing we need in the package, the first one is a climate bill, the second is more efficiency, the third is more renewables. Fourth thing we need in the package is more federal support for baseload generation. That means coal with carbon dioxide sequestration, Be very wary when you hear about a coal gasification process. Most of the proposals for this don't actually have the sequestration tagged on to the end. And you're only dealing with the climate issue if you actually sequester that CO2. Now, sequester is a good word. It's one of those words kind of like safe sex. And what sequester means in the case of CO2 is you pump volumes that occupy areas the size of small states back into gas wells or salt mines or caverns, and you try to keep it there forever. Now, my industry's had a lot of trouble trying to convince people we can handle nuclear waste. You can handle all the nuclear waste in areas the size of a few football fields. And it's solid. You can watch it. Carbon dioxide the size of states and keeping it underground is a whole nother matter. It's a very cumbersome and expensive fuel cycle. And then you get to new nuclear plants. I know of no one who seriously looks at both the science and economics that believes we can deal with climate without more nuclear plants, unless we have a technological breakthrough that we cannot identify today, like an improvement in solar that cuts its cost by a factor of 5 to 10. And if it's going to come, it almost surely has to come in solar. It's not going to come in biomass or wind. The numbers just don't work. And the other nations are going to do more nuclear. China, I think, has 30 nuclear plants on the drawing boards. But there are issues. You know, I believe there are something on the order of 400 or 450 nuclear plants around the world today. If you want nuclear to play a real role, you're talking about 1,500. And both the politics and the land and water use are very hard. So it's not easy to do. My point is, we don't know really how to deal with carbon as a nation or a world. We know elements. We know you need climate legislation. We know you need to push efficiency very hard. We know we need to test and try to drive renewables. But in the end, we also need one of these other technologies, things we know. The fifth thing we need is to keep developing competitive markets. There's a real issue here in that if you were to give folks like me the power to deal with this problem, which you won't, we just might try to solve it all with coal gasification and nuclear plants. And if you give people in politics the power to solve this problem, which you will, because you have no choice, they will try to solve it all with wind and renewables. And it doesn't work economically. So you've got to keep the market forces working so new ideas, new trade-offs like Debbie Moskowitz's offset, new technologies that no one else will bet on now have a chance to evolve into this marketplace. And the funny thing is, it turns out that the more competitive markets in the United States are already more receptive to things like wind. About 73% of the wind that's developed in this country is in the more competitive markets, even though less than half of the wind potential is in those markets. So I've given you 5 things that I think are inescapable to a good climate policy. We simply must have a good climate policy. We're going to do bad things to ourselves. We probably already have. We need to have a climate policy that involves a great deal of international cooperation. We probably need a climate policy with an escape hatch if China and India don't follow. It's inexcusable for us as a rich nation to ask them to go first. It makes no difference if we do it and they don't. I keep hearing different numbers for how many coal plants China is building. As I said, they want to build 30 nuclear plants. Some people tell me they're building a 500 megawatt coal plant every week. Some people tell me every 2 weeks. I tend to believe the latter number. But if they build a new 500 megawatt coal plant every 2 weeks, it doesn't make any difference what we do here. So this is a tough one. People around the world are demanding the prosperity that our kids have been taking for granted. They may not take it for granted in another 6 months, but they certainly did 6 months ago. My mother was a Depression baby, and it made her so frugal that she spent her whole life preparing for the next one. And some days I thought she was almost disappointed that it didn't occur before she died. But I had to get my inherent conservatism from somewhere. The point is, this is really tough stuff. Be very suspicious of people who tell you we shouldn't be dealing with this problem. Be equally suspicious of people who are telling you that we're going to be all richer and better off while we deal with it. Some resource issues really cost you money to deal with, and this one's a big one. Thank you for your attention. I'll do my best to answer questions till Alan tells me to do something else.
Norman Hanson with Energy USA. Should the automakers be required to start now making electric and hydrogen cars so that they can eliminate the economic crisis plus then reduce carbon dioxide?
I doubt it, because I think your very question poses the problem. Which are we going to require them to do? Personally, I'm very skeptical about the hydrogen economy, although Henry Linden down at IIT knows a lot more about it than I do, and he's less skeptical. My problem is, how are you going to get all the hydrogen? You're going to get it through a chemical process that's very energy intensive and creates its own CO2, or you're going to get it with nuclear plants. I got all the trouble I can imagine building the nuclear plants I'm going to need to meet the loads I see in the future, let alone building hydrogen for all the cars. I think the hybrid electric vehicle has much, much more potential. But in Germany, and we have someone from the German consulate here, they tend to believe that conventional diesel, souped up and improved, has a great deal of potential. The problem with requiring them to go out and just do it is we might pick the wrong thing and require them to spend their $17 billion or whatever we just gave them on the wrong stuff. I think you go back to my 5 things, plus things like tighter CAFE standards, and they were tightened a year ago. I think they can be tightened even more. It's very clear that the 2 biggest places you've got to get the most reductions are my industry, electricity, and automobiles. My own guess is that the economics are in what we call the plug-in hybrid. But that simply compounds the issue of where you're going to generate the electricity. Now, because the gasoline engine that we have today is so CO2 inefficient, and because the production of gasoline is not only involves some bad world political problems, but involves a lot of CO2, the numbers I have seen say that with plug-in hybrids, you should be able to reduce carbon even with today's electric generation system. But if you can clean up today's electric generation system by 50% and then use plug-in hybrids, then you have a combination that has a real impact. But I think you have to do it through a mix of tools, because otherwise we'll bet even more wrong than Detroit has bet, and that would be a shame.
John, thank you so much for that very illuminating presentation. I think we all appreciate it. I was wondering what your thoughts are on our military converting more to nuclear power. I think, you know, our Navy has served as a role model in that regard, but I just wondered how much we might be able to save if more branches followed suit.
I'm tempted to make a joke. I have a friend, a retired utility executive, who lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he moved there because he loves it. He says the problem is there are only two kinds of people in Santa Fe. The people downtown who hate retired utility executives, and the people up at Los Alamos who like nuclear devices that go boom. And I think you want to be just a little careful about spreading new kinds of nuclear devices around the military. They have quite a few of their own already. The problem, of course, is that the things we have that are nuclear powered, for example, aircraft carriers, are big. They are good things in a massive conventional war. They are nice platforms for things like the Iraqi war, but it doesn't translate to destroyers, let alone the whole thought of the nuclear-powered tank is something that even in my wildest fantasies I hadn't conceived of. I don't think it works, is the answer. And I'm afraid war will remain a very carbon-intensive process. Somebody's coming your way. Oh, there.
Thank you for your speech. It was very nice. Are you 100% sure? I'm trying to remember the figure you said. Electric utilities are responsible for 80% of carbon emissions.
No, it's about 40.
Huh?
It's about 40% of carbon emissions come from electricity
Okay.
in the U.S., about 40.
Okay, 40. I thought you said 80. I'm sorry. 'cause
80,
it's-
I'm not sure what the 80% number I used. Oh, coal is responsible for 80% of the emissions in the electricity industry. That's what I said.
Oh, okay, very good.
But the electricity industry as a whole is responsible for about 40% of U.S. CO2 emissions.
What would the other 60% be? Aviation?
Transportation
vehicles,
is the next biggest, and Katie, do you know? I think it's in the 20s or something like that. Maybe it's bigger than, maybe it's 30. And then you get all the way down, as I suggested early, to all the breathing us rude polluters are doing here tonight.
Hi, I'm Harold Myron from Argonne National Laboratory. I run the educational programs there. First of all, thank you for the illuminating talk and keeping our electrical prices at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Why is it, and I know that you're very interested in education, why is it that U.S. students can't and won't compete in science and technology? Because all your plans are based on people doing the work, whether it's diesel in Germany or hybrid or nuclear or whatever. And how can we change that? How can we change that in the future?
Well, I will give you what I believe to be the answer, even though it runs the risk of being painfully politically incorrect. The problem is science and engineering are really, really hard work, and an awful lot of rich kids don't want to do really, really hard work. You know, if you're smart and you come from a family like most of those here, it's awfully tempting to go to school and want to graduate and do policy. Now, policy is really easy work because we're all good at policy. Science and engineering are really hard work. And in my opinion, we as parents or grandparents or what the hell ever we are in here, gotta get kids to want to go back and do the hard work that good scientific and engineering careers take. And I think it's one of those cultural problems that has no quick solution. But now that I've given my politically correct answer, I'll add something more constructive. I mean, John Anderson and IIT and I are working very hard on trying to have more programs to provide scholarships for today's urban populations. We're doing more things to provide extra summer education. And Lou Collins actually started this while he was president of IIT. More things to provide extra summer education for kids who come out of Chicago's public school system and frankly are only in the rarest cases trained to do science at a college level. The breakdowns roughly are that the magnet schools in Chicago do a great job. It's not that the Chicago public school system can't teach. It can. It's just a lot easier to teach really smart kids. The magnet schools, Peyton, Disney, so forth, do a phenomenal job. But after that, we are not dealing with the cultural problems of the city. And the kind of low-income people who once decided to become engineers so they could eat aren't able to do it. So we're trying to work on more educational opportunities for today's urban residents. And that is fundamentally why Gene and I and Frank and Vera Clark and the company started the Roe Clark Math and Science Academy. We want a bunch of kids who come out of tough neighborhoods and usually broken homes to have a basis in high school such that they can do science and engineering. But respectfully, and I know this is the answer you really want, so this is an easy one, respectfully, we're not going to compete in tomorrow's world if we keep trying to borrow all our scientists and engineers from other countries. Won't work. I knew you wanted that answer.
Hi. Harold's just trying to have you make his job easier, I think. Thank you very much for the talk, Mr. Rowe. I'm Jim Schweitzer, Science Communication Consultants in Columbia College, and I think Exelon's 2020 plan is very interesting and laudable. And one of the major cornerstones of it is the challenge of educating people to efficiency. In fact, it's like one of the biggest pieces of the pie. How does a major utility or utility holding company plan to specifically educate people and make this efficiency thing happen? I know it's different for the people who report to you, but what about your consumers and clients?
Well, we put stuff on efficiency in our bill stuffers. You've seen ComEd's ads for its energy efficiency programs. Some of them are actually pretty good. Utilities very rarely get a good ad. We try to do that. We try to fund educational programs to the extent we can in our charitable budgets. There's probably a reason so many people from IIT are here. We just put $2 million into doing just that at IIT. So that might have something to do with the attendance tonight. But, you know, the problem is partly teaching people. It's also partly understanding that when people don't learn quite like you wanted, maybe they've got something else in mind. When I asked those kids how many of them had flat screen TVs, I didn't have one yet. Now I do. I like it. It's cool. Even old men can be cool, or at least they can feel cool. And, you know, one of the issues you have is, why does the customer not learn it quickly when you tell them? The answer isn't that the customer is stupid. The answer is that the customer has a lot of things going on in life. Convenience may be more important. Or maybe aesthetics are more important than the cost to a particular customer. bringing fluorescent lights to your living room and see what it does for domestic harmony, let alone bathroom. And industrial customers play all sorts of games by this. One of the issues, and it's one of the complexities of utility regulation, is a lot of people are prepared to bet that the government can keep the price of electricity down, so why should we be more efficient? Really happens. So you've got all those things. I think it needs more work through educational institutions. I also think it's that customers need to know that cost of carbon is in the marketplace and it keeps going up.
Mr. Rowe, you talked about two pillars to achieving a more carbon neutral economy. One of them was energy efficiency, which we've been discussing, and also another was competitive markets. And my question for you is whether Exelon would support increased goals for efficiency in Illinois and Pennsylvania, where you act, and specifically a policy similar to the policy on the West Coast of all cost-effective energy efficiency, as opposed to the current objectives of meeting statutory goals, which are less than all that's possibly cost-effective.
The answer is whether we'd support it or not depends on whether we can recover the costs of doing it. And we will not support things that run the risk of raising energy prices as high as the California Renewable Portfolio Standard will do. But we did support, indeed it was our language that went into the legislation to create the current utility energy efficiency programs. And whenever we see more opportunity to do it economically, we will support their expansion.
Okay, and then my second question is, you mentioned the importance of competitive markets, and right now in Illinois, the programs are designed and administered by ComEd, and ComEd's doing a terrific job. My question, though, is whether you would be open, or whether Exelon would be open to seeking ideas from the marketplace and allowing others outside the utility to introduce new programs, new technologies, new ideas.
Oh, sure, and that's one of the things the Illinois competitive market already makes open. Because you as a customer can actually find another supplier for your energy, and if you find one who will give you a really sexy package of energy efficiency measures along with it, you can do that legally. And in addition to that, you've got lots of people, Johnson Controls up in Wisconsin is a beautiful example of this, who actually are very good at selling industrial and commercial companies energy efficiency products. So we would support that in almost any way I can foresee.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
You want one more?
Mark Peters from Argonne National Laboratory. Could you give me a little bit more of your perspective on what the federal government could do with nuclear in terms of loan guarantees and dealing with the waste in the near term?
Right. The policy in the U.S. has been for 30 years that the waste would go to one federal, maybe 50 years, federal government-owned geologic repository. And that was proposed for Yucca Mountain, and Yucca Mountain's not going anywhere at the moment. So the issue is, what will the federal government do next? The logical thing is probably regional retrievable surface storage facilities, or perhaps underground but still fully retrievable. The problem is, if you got made 2 senators really mad with Yucca Mountain, you might make 10 mad with regional facilities. So right now the de facto policy is to make each nuclear site a storage facility, and that's not a good long-run solution. I think someday we more largely close the fuel cycle, and we burn up a lot of that waste in reprocessing, and perhaps in breeder reactors, but that's on the 30 to 50 year scale. That's not on the 10 to 20 year scales. So that's the rough answer to that. And what the federal government is doing with loan guarantees, right now there have been $19 billion appropriated for new loan guarantees to new nuclear plants. A new nuclear plant costs $4 to $6 billion depending on its size. So, you know, maybe that's enough money to be a significant help for 6 or 8 nuclear plants, but not much more than that. And I don't think you will see more loan guarantees for nuclear plants in the first year or two of the new administration. This probably should be the last one.
My name is Lynn Perrins, and I'm a recent college graduate from the University of Wisconsin. And seeing as there are a lot of young people in the crowd here, I just wanted to pose a question to you as to what you would recommend for the younger generation as the most productive way to get involved with this issue and an effective way, since we are very concerned about this for our own as well.
Well, it wouldn't hurt to go into science or engineering. I will speak for that. I think the answer is there are a ton of effective ways. The most rapid changes in technology are occurring at the end use, in energy efficiency. It turns out you can make improvements much faster when you're dealing with watts and microwatts than you can make when you're dealing with megawatts and gigawatts. So there's a lot of technological opportunity in energy efficiency. But second, you can pick almost any part of the supply side. Nuclear, carbon sequestration, more advanced solar. I mean, there are going to be jobs in all of these areas because carbon policy is going to make them there. So I think the career opportunities are virtually infinite there. And my one caution is, don't graduate from school and decide to do policy. It's really it's very easy to conceive and very hard to execute. And it's much better to do a little science or engineering or, God forbid, even law first. Thank you.
John, thank you. Well, that was really great. I'm glad that, John, I took chemistry when I went to school. I would like to reiterate that we are a new organization, and outside you will find a table where you can sign up to be members of this organization. There also are pieces of paper for you to fill out. We are anxious to collect those and make sure that we are delivering the kind of programs, and we're organizing them properly, so we look at those. We have a dinner this evening for members of the board, members of our President's Council. If you pay $1,000, you can be a member of the President's Council and have free dinners. And
You could buy me dinner cheaper than that. You're a better day.
John, you've already earned the dinner for the evening. So with that, our next one is bioterrorism. And what's the date of that, Aaron? 27th. And that is a panel. I have an excellent lead-off from Northwestern University. And it is another one of our plans to deliver information on important topics by people who know something about the topic, as John obviously did. So once again, John, thank you very much.